They say time heals everything, but some hearts never stop waiting. This story isn't about young love, the kind that burns fast and fades. It's about Evelyn Carter and Thomas Miller, two people who once had it all, and then lost it to life, distance, and pride. Decades passed. They built separate lives, made choices they couldn't undo, and learned to live with silence. But fate, or maybe love itself, had other plans. Now, at 65, when most people think life slows down, they find each other again, not in a crowded city or a grand reunion, but in the quiet corners of time, where memories still whisper and old hearts learn to beat again. This is a story about second chances, about love that never asked for, forever, only another moment. Because sometimes, the heart doesn't move on, it simply waits for the right season to love again. Asterisk, the autumn air in Portland was cool and sweet. Carrying the faint smell of rain and pine trees, Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the park, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her beige coat, watching the leaves fall like soft whispers from the tall maples. 65, she still couldn't believe it. Time had slipped past her like a long train she forgot to board. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry today, but the sound of the jazz music drifting from the old cafe across the street was playing their song, the same one Thomas used to hum when they drove down to the Oregon coast, windows down, her head resting on his shoulder. God, I was so young, she murmured to herself, so stupidly young. Evelyn had built a quiet, steady life, 2 grown children, a little house near the river, a garden she loved, but there was a part of her heart that never moved on. The part that had stayed frozen on that night, 40 years ago. When she and Thomas said goodbye without really saying goodbye, she crossed the street and stepped into Harbor Cafe, a place that had been there forever. The bell above the door chimed, and the warmth of coffee and laughter wrapped around her. She sat in her usual corner booth, the same spot she used to share with him when the world was simpler, and love didn't hurt so much. She was sipping her cappuccino when the door opened again. A gust of wind rushed in, and with it, a man in a dark blue coat, silver hair catching the light. Evelyn looked up. Her heart stopped. Thomas Miller. He stood at the door, hesitant, as if time itself had paused. The years had left their marks. On his face, faint lines, gentle creases, but his eyes, those deep gray eyes, still had the same softness she remembered. He noticed her almost instantly. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as though the entire cafe vanished, leaving only the sound of rain and their shared heartbeat echoing in the air. Evelyn, he finally said, his voice low, unsure. She smiled faintly. Hi, Thomas. He laughed, a quiet, disbelieving laugh, and walked over to her table. You look exactly the same. Liar, she said with a grin that trembled a little. You're wearing half your age in wrinkles. He chuckled, sliding into the seat across from her. Well, I earned every single one. They sat in silence for a moment, studying each other like ghosts of a life they once lived. The years hadn't erased the familiarity. If anything, it had deepened it. So, Evelyn said softly, what brings you back to Portland? He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Would you believe me if I said? Coffee. She smirked, not for a second. Thomas exhaled slowly. I came back for a funeral. My brother passed away last week. I thought I'd visit some old places before heading back to Chicago. Her expression softened. I'm sorry, Thomas. I didn't know. He nodded. Life keeps finding ways to remind me how short it is. He paused, then smiled faintly. I didn't expect to see you here. Though, neither did I, she said. I come here every Friday. It's quiet, familiar. He looked around the cafe and then back at her. Still chasing the same kind of peace, huh? She tilted her head. And you? Still running from it? Thomas laughed again, shaking his head. You never forget how to throw a punch. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence. Then Evelyn asked, do you ever think about us? Back then, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the glass. Every single day, he said finally, but I figured, you moved on. Married, kids, a new life. I did, she said, but that doesn't mean I forgot you. He looked back at her, eyes searching. You shouldn't have to remember me, Evelyn. I was the one who walked away. She smiled gently. And I was the one who let you. For a long moment, they just sat there, 2 old souls, sitting across from each other, caring for decades of unspoken words. The air between them was heavy with everything they hadn't said. Finally, Thomas whispered, you know, I kept your letters. Evelyn blinked. What? He smiled faintly. Every one of them. They were yellowed and torn by the time I found them last year, tucked away in an old box. I read them all. I realized how badly I'd hurt you. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You did, but maybe we both needed to grow up to understand what love really is. He reached across the table, his wrinkled hand brushing against hers. And what's that, Evelyn? What is love? She looked down at their hands, old, imperfect, trembling slightly, and then met his gaze. Love, she said quietly, is remembering someone, even when the world forgets them. He smiled, eyes misting. Then I guess I never stopped loving you. Outside, the rain turned to snow, soft, pure, and silent. Inside the cafe, two people who once lost everything found something again, a spark that time could never kill. As they sat there, laughing through tears, Evelyn realized something simple yet profound: love doesn't fade with age. It deepens, becomes quieter, more forgiving. And maybe, just maybe, this was their second chance. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She kept replaying every moment from the cafe, the way Thomas smiled, the sound of his voice, the warmth of his hand brushing hers. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped into a memory that refused to fade. For years, she had convinced herself that he was part of a past life, a different version of her that no longer existed. But now, with one unexpected meeting, the walls she had built around her heart were trembling again. The next morning, she stood in front of her mirror, brushing her silver hair and laughing quietly to herself. "Why am I smiling like a teenager?" she thought. It was ridiculous. She was 65, not 16. But her reflection didn't lie. Her eyes had that same glimmer she used to have decades ago when Thomas would show up at her college dorm with a single rose and a wild grin. Her phone buzzed. A text message. "Thomas, coffee, again tomorrow. Same place." Evelyn's heart did a little flip. She typed back quickly, "You're persistent." A few seconds later, "Thomas, I lost 40 years. I'm not wasting another day." She smiled, shaking her head. "Still knows how to say the right thing," she whispered. The next day, she arrived early. The cafe was nearly empty, sunlight spilling through the windows, painting soft golden patterns on the wooden floor. She ordered 2 coffees before he even arrived, one black, one with cream and a hint of cinnamon, just the way he used to like it. He walked in wearing the same blue coat, but this time with a small bouquet of daisies in his hand. "For you," he said, smiling shyly. "They reminded me of your old garden." Evelyn took them, her heart swelling. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said softly. They sat down, and for a while, neither spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was peaceful, like silence had become a language only they understood. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever wish we could go back?" He looked thoughtful. "Sometimes, but then I realize, if we hadn't gone our separate ways, maybe we wouldn't appreciate this moment as much as we do now." She smiled sadly. "You always did find meaning in everything." Thomas chuckled. "And you always called it nonsense." Evelyn laughed, shaking her head. "I still do." They both smiled, and for a brief second, the years disappeared. They were young again, sitting by the ocean, her hair flying in the wind, his arm around her shoulders, dreaming about forever. After coffee, Thomas suggested a walk by the river. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of wet leaves. They strolled slowly, matching each other's pace, their steps soft on the path. "I used to walk here, after you left," Evelyn admitted quietly. "Every Sunday, I'd sit on that bench and wonder if you ever thought of me." Thomas stopped walking. "I did. But I was too proud to come back, too scared to face you." She turned to him. "Why?" He looked at her with eyes full of regret. "Because I knew if I saw you again, I'd never be able to leave." Her throat tightened. "You should have stayed anyway." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I should have." A long silence followed. The river moved gently beside them, carrying fallen leaves downstream, tiny reminders of how time moves on, whether we're ready or not. Then, out of nowhere, Thomas asked, "Do you still paint?" Evelyn blinked in surprise. "You remember that?" "Of course," he said with a grin. "You used to say colors spoke louder than words. You painted everything, the beach, the sunsets, even my old beat-up car." She laughed softly. "I stopped years ago. Life got busy. Then it got quiet." He nodded. "Start again. Paint something for me." Her smile faded. "Why now, Thomas, after all this time?" He shrugged lightly, eyes still gentle. "Because we don't get forever, and I don't want to waste what's left." That line hit her like a wave. It wasn't romantic in a movie sense. It was honest. A kind of love that comes not from desire, but from deep understanding. They kept walking until the sun began to set. The sky turned shades of pink and gold, and the light shimmered across the water. Thomas turned to her and said softly, "I missed this. Not just you, but us. The way we used to see the world together." Evelyn felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "Maybe it's not too late to see it again," she said quietly. He smiled, his hand gently brushing against hers. "Then let's start now." That night, Evelyn returned home and pulled out a dusty box from her closet, old sketchbooks, paintbrushes, and tubes of dried acrylic paint. She hadn't touched them in over 2 decades. She sat by the window, moonlight spilling onto the table, and began to draw not the ocean or the sunset this time, but him. Every line she painted carried a memory. His laugh, his eyes, his kindness. And when she was done, she whispered to herself, "Maybe love doesn't die. It just waits for us to grow old enough to understand it." Evelyn woke up early that Sunday morning to the sound of rain tapping softly on her window. The world outside looked gray and peaceful, the kind of morning that invited coffee, warmth, and memories. She sat by the window, sipping her coffee, staring at the half-finished painting she'd started the night before. Thomas's face stared back at her from the canvas. Gentle, kind, touched with time. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. Her phone buzzed. Thomas, rainy days were your favorite. Remember? Evelyn, they still are. Just missing the company. Thomas, I can fix that. Breakfast. She smiled. You're impossible, Thomas, and hungry. 30 minutes later, he was at her door holding a brown paper bag and grinning like a schoolboy. Blueberry pancakes, he said proudly, just like the ones you used to make. Evelyn laughed, stepping aside. Come in before you get soaked. He entered her cozy little house, shaking off the rain from his coat. The smell of fresh paint and lavender candles filled the air. His eyes fell on the easel by the window and the painting. He froze. Is that me? He asked softly. Evelyn hesitated, embarrassed. It's just a sketch. I was practicing. Thomas walked closer, studying it. The brushstrokes were soft yet detailed, every line of his face captured with affection. You still paint with your heart, he murmured. She blushed slightly. It's been a while. He smiled. You didn't forget how they sat at her small wooden table, eating pancakes and laughing like old times. It felt natural, like no time had passed at all. Thomas looked around the house. The family photos, the soft yellow walls, the stacks of books by the window. You built a beautiful life here, he said. Evelyn nodded, smiling faintly. I did, but it was quiet. Maybe too quiet sometimes. He looked down at his plate. I had quiet too. I just never realized how loud loneliness can be. She met his eyes, her heart softening. You never remarried? He shook his head. No, I tried, once, but it didn't last. I guess my heart never really left 1978. She smiled sadly. Neither did mine. The rain grew heavier outside, drumming softly against the roof. Thomas glanced at the painting again. You know, that picture. It makes me wonder how you saw me all these years. Evelyn sipped her coffee. I saw you, as you were kind, stubborn, full of dreams, and a little afraid. He laughed. Still am. Afraid of what? She asked gently. He looked at her for a long time before answering. Afraid that I'll lose you again. The room fell silent. The only sound was the rain. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand on his. You won't, she said softly. Not this time. Later that afternoon, they drove to the old pier near the coast, the same place they used to visit in their 20s. The ocean was wild that day, waves crashing against the rocks with raw energy. Evelyn stood at the edge, the wind whipping through her hair. It's strange, she said. I used to come here when I missed you. Now you're here, and it still feels unreal. Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe love always feels that way, a little unreal. They sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching the sky shift between gray and silver. You remember that day we promised to come here every summer? He asked. She laughed. You mean the promise you broke first? He grinned, sheepishly. Yeah, I was young and stupid. You still are, she teased. He laughed, and she joined in, that easy, familiar laughter that once filled their college dorms and road trips. After a long pause, Evelyn said, Thomas, can I ask you something? Anything, do you think? Love changes with age. He thought for a moment before answering. Maybe it doesn't change, maybe we do. When we're young, we love to be seen. When we're older, we love to understand. She looked at him, touched. That's beautiful, he smiled softly. You taught me that. For a moment, neither spoke. The ocean roared beneath them, timeless and endless, just like the bond they were rediscovering. That evening, as Thomas drove her home, the world outside their car was quiet. Streetlights flickered through the misty rain, painting golden reflections on the wet pavement. Evelyn looked out the window, her heart full. She whispered, You know, it's strange. I used to dream of seeing you again. But now that you're here, it feels like I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, his voice gentle. Then let's not waste it. When she got home, Evelyn stood by her window again, watching his car disappear into the night. A soft smile touched her lips. Love, she thought, wasn't about forever. It was about moments like these, rare, quiet, and impossibly beautiful. And for the first time in decades, she felt peace, not because the past was gone, but because it had finally led her back to where she belonged. The following week, Portland bloomed into spring, bright skies, soft winds, and cherry blossoms painting the streets pink. Evelyn had begun painting again every morning, her living room now filled with canvases, ocean scenes, sunrises, and one portrait that Thomas insisted she never sell. He visited often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with nothing but that quiet smile that always softened her day. They didn't need plans anymore. Their time together was slow, simple, and deeply human. One afternoon, as they sat on her porch drinking lemonade, Thomas said, You ever think about what people will say? Two old fools falling in love again. Evelyn laughed softly. They'll probably say it's sweet. He shook his head, pretending to frown. No, they'll say I'm desperate. She grinned. Then they'd be right. They both laughed, the sound echoing through the yard like music. Later that evening, they decided to walk downtown. The air was cool and smelled faintly of coffee and rain. A local jazz band played on the corner near Harbor Cafe, and a small crowd gathered to listen. Thomas took Evelyn's hand suddenly. "Dance with me." She blinked. "Here, in the street." "Why not?" he said, smiling. "We never got to dance at prom, remember?" Evelyn blushed. "Thomas, people are watching. Let 'em." He pulled her close, and for a moment, the years melted away. The music was slow and sweet, saxophone and piano melting into the hum of the city. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he whispered, "You still fit right here." She smiled. Maybe because we never outgrew each other. The world around them faded, just two silhouettes swaying beneath the city lights, living proof that love doesn't belong to the young. When the song ended, people clapped. Evelyn laughed, cheeks flushed. "We're ridiculous." Thomas grinned. "Maybe, but I don't care anymore." That night, they sat in his car, outside her house. Neither wanted to say goodbye. Evelyn looked at him and asked softly, "Do you ever get scared?" He tilted his head. "Of what? Of this? Of getting close again?" After everything, Thomas was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally, "every day, but I think being scared means it still matters." She nodded, her eyes gentle. "That's the problem with love, isn't it? It always asks for courage when we feel too old to be brave." He smiled faintly. "Then let's be brave anyway." The next morning, Evelyn woke up to a call from Thomas. His voice sounded faintly tired but warm. "Morning, sunshine. You busy today?" "Just painting," she said. "Why?" "Thought we could take a little trip. The coast, maybe." Her heart lifted. "You mean our coast?" He chuckled. "Is there any other?" She packed a small bag, sketchbook, scarf, and the photo they'd taken together at the cafe last week. When he arrived, she noticed something different. His smile was there, but his eyes seemed distant, like he was fighting something he didn't want to talk about. "Everything okay?" she asked gently, as she got into the car. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." She didn't press further. They drove in silence for a while, the road curving through green hills and sunlit valleys. The radio played old songs from the 70s, the soundtrack of their youth. When they finally reached Cannon Beach, Evelyn stepped out and inhaled deeply. The salty wind brushed against her face. "It hasn't changed," she said softly. Thomas smiled faintly. "Neither have you." They walked along the shore, shoes in hand, letting the waves kiss their feet. It felt like a dream, the kind that makes you ache when you wake up. At one point, Evelyn noticed him pause and press a hand to his chest. "Thomas?" she asked, alarmed. He forced a small smile, just a little out of breath. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. She could see it, the slight tremor in his hand, the pale color of his skin. "Sit down," she said firmly. He resisted at first, but then sighed and lowered himself onto a driftwood log. The ocean roared behind them as Evelyn knelt beside him. "Thomas, when was the last time you saw a doctor?" He hesitated. "A while." Her tone softened. "How long is a while?" He looked down. 6 months. Maybe more." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. "You can't ignore this." He gave a weak chuckle. "You sound like my mother." She crossed her arms. "Then maybe your mother was right." Thomas sighed and finally nodded. "Okay, I'll go. I promise." Evelyn reached out and held his hand. "Don't scare me like that again." He smiled faintly. "Guess I just needed a reason to stick around." They stayed until sunset. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, waves glowing like liquid fire. Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "Thomas," she whispered, "yeah, if love really doesn't grow old, then I think this right here is what it looks like." He turned to her, eyes soft. "It's not the sunsets or the memories, Evelyn, it's sitting next to you even when I'm scared and still feeling at peace." She smiled. "Then promise me something. Anything. No matter what happens, we don't run away this time." He took her hand and kissed it gently. "I promise." The wind carried their words away into the evening sky, two souls rediscovering the courage to love again, even when the body grows old and fragile. That night, Evelyn lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of rain outside. She felt joy, fear, and hope all tangled together, emotions she hadn't felt in years. And somewhere in that storm of feeling, she whispered into the darkness, "Please, not this time. Let love stay." 2 weeks passed after their trip to Cannon Beach, and Evelyn began to notice the small things. Thomas didn't walk as fast. He got winded climbing her porch steps. Sometimes, he'd pause mid-sentence and press his hand gently to his chest, pretending it was nothing. She knew better. One afternoon, she decided to go with him to his doctor's appointment, whether he liked it or not. When they sat in the waiting room, Thomas looked uneasy. "You really didn't have to come, Evie." She folded her arms. "You're right, but if I didn't, you'd probably tell the doctor you're perfectly fine and go back to pretending you're 20. He smirked. "I might still do that." "Try me," she said, raising an eyebrow. The nurse called his name. Evelyn followed him in. The doctor, a calm middle-aged woman named Dr. Patel, greeted them warmly and asked a few questions before sending Thomas for some tests. When they came back, she sat down, folded her hands, and said gently, "Thomas, You have a minor heart condition. It's not immediately dangerous, but you'll need treatment and to take things easy for a while. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She wanted to be strong, but the word heart hit her like a stone. Thomas sighed. I figured it was something like that. Dr. Patel smiled kindly. You've got a good heart, it just needs a little help. Evelyn squeezed his hand. Hear that? Even your doctor agrees you have a good heart. He chuckled softly. Don't make me blush in front of professionals. That night, after they left the clinic, they stopped by a small diner they used to visit in their 20s. It hadn't changed much. Same red booths, same smell of coffee and fries. They sat by the window. Thomas stirred his coffee, absent-mindedly. Evelyn broke the silence first. You scared me today. He looked up, guilt flickering across his face. I'm sorry. She shook her head. Don't be sorry. Just, don't shut me out again. I didn't mean to, he said quietly. I just didn't want you to worry. Thomas, she said softly, love isn't about protecting someone from worry. It's about letting them worry with you. He stared at her for a long moment, then reached across the table and took her hand. You're the first person who's ever said that like it's a good thing. She smiled faintly. Maybe that's why I'm still here. Over the next few weeks, their days found a new rhythm. Morning coffee at Evelyn's porch. Afternoon walks by the river. Slower now, but no less precious. They spent evenings watching old movies, their fingers loosely intertwined on the couch. One night, during Casablanca, Thomas said quietly, You know, I used to think love was something that fades. Like a song, beautiful for a while, then gone. Evelyn turned to him, and now, he looked at her, his eyes tired but peaceful. Now I think love just changes its tune. Slower, softer, but still playing. Evelyn felt her chest ache with affection. That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said. He grinned. Must be the meds. One morning, Thomas called her earlier than usual. His voice sounded shaky. Evie, can you come over? Her heart dropped. What's wrong? Nothing serious, he said quickly. Just, could use some company. She arrived 10 minutes later. He was sitting on his couch, looking pale. I'm fine, he said before she could speak. Just felt dizzy. Evelyn sat beside him, gently taking his hand. You don't have to be strong all the time, Thomas. He gave a weak smile. Old habits die hard. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Then maybe it's time we start new ones. They stayed like that for a while. No words, no need to fill the silence. Just the quiet comfort of two people who finally understood that love isn't about forever. It's about today. Evening, Evelyn cooked for him, grilled salmon and mashed potatoes. His favorite. They ate by candlelight because the power had gone out in half the neighborhood. As the wind howled outside, Thomas reached across the table and said softly, You ever think about how lucky we are to get a second chance at this age? Of all things, Evelyn smiled. It's not luck, it's timing. The universe waited until we were wise enough not to mess it up. He laughed quietly. Maybe, or maybe the universe just got tired of watching me eat microwave dinners alone. She laughed too, and for a while, it felt like time didn't exist, just two souls sharing warmth in a world that sometimes forgets how to slow down. Later that night, as she was leaving, Thomas walked her to the door. Evie, he said softly, Yep, thank you for staying. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. You don't have to thank me, Thomas. I stayed because I finally learned something. What's that? That love doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just sits quietly beside you, holding your hand when words don't work anymore. He smiled gently. You should write that down. I just did, she whispered. Then she kissed his cheek, smiled, and stepped out into the cool night. As she drove home through the rain, Evelyn realized something she'd never understood in her youth. Love isn't about how many times you say I love you. It's about how many times you show up when it matters most. And for the first time in years, she felt safe, not because life was perfect, but because she finally knew she wasn't facing it alone. The summer rolled in slow and golden, like honey dripping from the sky. For Evelyn and Thomas, it felt like life had pressed pause. No deadlines, no expectations, no noise. Just sunlight, slow mornings, and the kind of silence that feels full, not empty. Thomas's health had stabilized. The medication helped, but so did Evelyn's presence. He often joked that she was his real medicine, and she'd roll her eyes, saying, Then you better follow the dosage. Mr. Thai. One morning, Evelyn suggested something that made him light up like a kid again. Let's take a road trip, she said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. A road trip, he repeated. Evie, my back can barely handle the grocery store parking lot. She smiled. Then we'll stop often, drive slow. We'll go somewhere quiet, where time doesn't matter. He grinned. Where are we going? She looked out the window. Where it all started, to the lake, Lake Willamette, the place where they'd met in their 20s, where he'd taught her how to skip stones, and where she'd told him she wanted to see the world before settling down. Neither of them had been back since 2 days later. They packed up his old blue Ford pickup, a relic that somehow still ran, and hit the road. The drive was long, winding through pine forests and sleepy towns. Thomas played old country songs on the radio, and Evelyn sang along, her voice soft but steady. He watched her while she sang, gray hair glowing in the sunlight, wrinkles that told stories instead of hiding them. And he thought, she's more beautiful now than she ever was. Evelyn caught him staring. Eyes on the road. Mr. Miller, he smirked. Can't you? The view. Asterisk, they reached the lake by evening. The water shimmered gold under the setting sun, and the air smelled like pine and nostalgia. For a long moment, they just stood there, to 65-year-old souls, standing in the same spot where young hearts once made promises they couldn't keep. Evelyn whispered, "It feels smaller now." Thomas nodded. "Maybe we just got bigger." They set up the folding chairs by the water and watched the ripples dance. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was the kind of silence that only people who've truly known each other can share. Asterisk, after a while, Thomas said, "You know, I used to come here after you left." Evelyn turned. "You did?" "Yeah. I'd sit by the water, skip stones, and pretend you were still here. Guess I never really stopped." Evelyn reached out and placed her hand over his. "Then maybe you were just waiting for me to come back." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I was." After a while, Thomas said, "You know, I used to come here after you left." Evelyn turned. "You did?" "Yeah. I'd sit by the water, skip stones, and pretend you were still here. Guess I never really stopped." Evelyn reached out and placed her hand over his. "Then maybe you were just waiting for me to come back." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I was." They spent the next few days by the lake. Mornings started with coffee and laughter, afternoons with gentle walks, and evenings by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, talking about everything they once thought they'd forgotten. One night, as the stars came out, Evelyn said softly, "Do you ever regret anything, Thomas?" He took a deep breath. "Sometimes I regret not fighting harder. But then I think, maybe we had to live our separate lives to really understand love." Evelyn nodded. "Maybe love isn't about holding on. Maybe it's about finding your way back, when the world finally quiets down enough to hear your heart again." He looked at her, eyes glistening in the firelight. "That's exactly what it is." The next morning, Thomas woke up early and walked to the dock. Evelyn found him sitting there, legs dangling over the water, a small smile on his face. "Morning," she said, sitting beside him. "Morning, Evie." He pointed toward the horizon. "Remember how you used to say you wanted to see the world?" She smiled. "Yeah," he chuckled. "We never made it to Europe, but look at this. Not bad, huh?" She followed his gaze, the soft mist rising from the lake, the reflection of trees swaying on the surface, and the quiet hum of life that didn't need an audience. "It's perfect," she whispered. He nodded. "You ever think, maybe the world isn't something you travel? Maybe it's someone you find?" She looked at him, her heart swelling. "I think I just did." Later that day, they decided to write something together. A note, just a small one, tucked into a glass bottle. Evelyn scribbled as Thomas dictated. "If you find this, know that love doesn't end when years pass or faces change. It just waits patiently, quietly, until you're ready to see it again. We're proof of that." T&E. They sealed the bottle and tossed it into the lake, watching it drift away. Neither of them spoke for a while. The only sound was the soft splash of water against the shore. Evelyn finally said, "Do you think anyone will ever find it?" Thomas smiled. "Maybe not, but maybe it's not meant to be found. Maybe it's just meant to float, like love does." That evening, as the sun dipped low, Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. They didn't talk about the future, or time, or what might come next. They just sat there, letting the world fade into colors, orange, pink, blue, as if time itself had decided to slow down for them. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something simple and true. Love doesn't need to shout to be real. It doesn't need to prove itself with grand gestures or promises. Sometimes, it just stays. Quiet, steady, eternal. And that, she thought, was the lesson all those years had been trying to teach her. Autumn crept in quietly, like a soft sigh through the trees. Leaves turned gold, then amber, then brown, and the air carried that familiar chill that whispers nothing lasts forever. Evelyn and Thomas had returned home from the lake weeks ago, but the feeling lingered, that sacred stillness, that peace they'd found by the water. They saw each other every day. Some days they talked for hours. Some days they didn't talk at all. They didn't need to. Love, at that age, didn't need words. It was in the way she folded his blanket when he napped, the way he always brought her morning coffee just the way she liked it, 1 spoon of sugar, no cream. The way they sat through long silences without feeling the need to fill them. One crisp October morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of her phone ringing. It was Thomas. "Morning, Evie," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You busy?" "Not really," she replied. "You sound tired." He chuckled faintly. "Didn't sleep much. Thought maybe we could watch the sunrise?" One last time. Evelyn felt something inside her tighten. The way he said it, one last time. She threw on her sweater, grabbed her keys, and drove to his house. The sky was still gray, the horizon just starting to glow faintly pink. Thomas was waiting on the porch, wrapped in his old flannel jacket, a thermos of coffee beside him. He smiled when he saw her. "Didn't think you'd make it this early." She sat beside him. "You should know by now, I always show up." They sat in silence as the sky slowly came alive. Orange and gold painted the edges of the clouds, and the first light of day brushed against their faces. Thomas looked at her and said quietly, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Evelyn hesitated. "You mean, after this?" He nodded. She smiled sadly. "I used to. Now, I just think about how lucky I am to be here with you, to see this sunrise." He reached for her hand. "I never thought we'd get this. After all those years apart, I thought love was something you lose once, and it's gone forever." Evelyn's voice trembled. "Maybe love just takes a long time to come home." He laughed softly. "Yeah, maybe it does." They watched the sun lift higher, the world around them waking up, birds, wind, the distant sound of cars. For a while, they just breathed it in. Evelyn turned to say something, but Thomas's eyes were closed. "Thomas?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His head rested gently against her shoulder, his face peaceful. For a long moment, Evelyn didn't move. She just sat there, holding his hand, watching the sunlight touch his skin. It didn't feel like an ending. Not really. It felt like the world had paused to honor something sacred. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled through it. "You did it, Thomas," she whispered. "You made it to one more sunrise." Later that day, as she sat by his chair, the doctor gently told her that he'd passed away quietly. No pain, no struggle, just peace. Evelyn nodded, listening but not breaking. She didn't need to. She'd spent enough of her life crying over goodbyes. This time, it wasn't goodbye. It was just love, changing shape. Weeks went by, the trees shed their last leaves, and winter began to settle over Portland. Evelyn spent her mornings walking by the river, the same way they used to. She'd talk to him sometimes, quietly, like he was still beside her. One morning, she returned to the lake. She sat on the same dock where they'd thrown that bottle into the water. The lake was frozen now, silent and still. She whispered, "I kept my promise, Thomas. I came back." From her pocket, she pulled a folded piece of paper. It was his handwriting. She had found it tucked into one of hhis books after the funeral. "If you ever come back to the lake, don't be sad. Just look at the water and remember, love doesn't end, it just changes its home. Mine lives in you now." Evelyn pressed the note to her heart, tears falling freely this time, not from pain, but from gratitude. Then she smiled, looking at the reflection of the sunrise on the frozen water. "Guess we're still watching together," she whispered. Years later, someone found that glass bottle they had thrown into the lake. Inside was their note, faded, but still readable. The couple who found it posted it online, and it went viral. People all over the world shared it, calling it the forever message. It read, "If you find this, know that love doesn't end when years pass or faces change. It just waits patiently, quietly, until you're ready to see it again." No one knew who T&E were, but somewhere, beyond time, they did, sitting side by side, watching another sunrise that would never fade. And that was the lesson Evelyn's life left behind. Love isn't about youth, beauty, or time. It's about finding someone whose soul feels like home and realizing that even when bodies age and years disappear, real love never grows old. Sometimes, love doesn't happen in our 20s, it happens when we've lived enough to understand its meaning. Evelyn and Thomas taught us that love isn't about how long it lasts, but how deeply it's felt. Because when two souls truly belong to each other, time may change their faces, but never their hearts.